Our topic this evening is Marcionism, his teachings, and the Marcionite Church. This is one that, as we look back on it, I was surprised we haven't already done. This is a very interesting, influential early Christian who expressed an alternate kind of Christianity that proto-Orthodox community ended up defining as heretical. And so we'll look at all of the background of this tonight. So we've noted in multiple other lectures that we've done that Christianity didn't begin in the 1st and 2nd centuries as a single unified institution that had a organized hierarchy with one person as the leader who was able to appoint others and discipline them and so on. Rather, it really got going as a diversity of early Christian communities in the towns and cities spread across the Roman Empire and a little bit beyond its border, each of which was planted by mendicant apostles, that is to say, prophets and teachers that were preaching the gospel by the Holy Spirit, begging for their daily bread, living on the hospitality of strangers and also members of the Christian communities that they were founding. And there were, of course, many more of these than 12, so including some of the major leaders that we know about who were historical figures. The historical Paul, who was not one of the 12 apostles, the historical James, the brother of Jesus, the leader of the church in Jerusalem, who was also not among the 12, but other apostles, historical apostles that were, Peter and John. And then from the letters of Paul, he talks about an apostle, Apollos, who was considered by a faction anyway within the church in Corinth as a leader, a potentially authoritative leader. And he also talks about 2 apostles in the Church of Rome, a early Christian community that neither Paul nor Peter founded, the apostles Junia and Andronicus. So different communities looked to different leaders as authoritative, but they may have done so at different times. So that could have depended on who happened to be there. Paul left Corinth, Apollos moved in. People started to think of Apollos as authoritative. Likewise, Paul and Peter had been in Antioch together. Paul moved on, and so the Antioch church maybe developed more of a Petrine character after Paul left, and so forth. So when we look back to that very earliest stratum, the first generation of Christianity that Paul inhabited, we see a very particular early controversy at that layer. Because although Christianity began as a sect of Judaism, and its initial leaders, more or less, had all been Jewish in background, they nevertheless followed a call to share their gospel with all nations. And the word for that is Gentile. The Latin word for nation is gens, gentis. And so in other words, all non-Jewish nations. And as the number of Gentile Christians grew, the question, should Christians all obey Mosaic law, became a very core controversy. And we've looked at that as something that, takes place all through Paul's letters. And then there are echoes of it in some of the early Jamesian associated scriptures that made their way into the New Testament. However, that said, a compromise was mostly ironed out early. So both Paul himself in Galatians, which is much earlier than Acts, but also the author of Acts, record traditions that part of the controversy anyway was resolved with a compromise that allowed Gentile Christians to not follow the law of Moses. So in other words, they didn't need to, males didn't need to get circumcised, you didn't need to keep kosher, follow dietary and purity restrictions and so forth. But even with that compromise, that left open the question for those Christians who did have a Jewish background, people like James, the brother of Jesus, who had always followed all of those rules. Should he and his Jewish Christian followers continue following the law of Moses. So that's left for the next layer of fighting. Another thing that happens at this second layer, so after the apostolic age starts to wane, by the end of the first and into the second centuries, individual Christian communities became established. They didn't need as much to be led by wandering mendicant apostles. And as they became established, they had regular needs. And so they appointed overseers, which we get the word bishop from that, and also helpers, from which we get the word deacon. And so already, by the time of a first century text like the Didache, a very important early Christian manual that was left out of the New Testament, already by then and by the time people were writing letters in Paul's name, but were not actually Paul, so in other words, they post-date Paul, letters like the letters to Titus and Timothy. These new leaders, bishops, were displacing the earlier apostles and prophets, and now bishops and their helpers, the deacons, are starting to lead congregations. And over time, a single bishop is understood as the leader of each individual congregation or church as established in each of the different towns and cities of the Roman Empire. But there's still an incredible amount of diversity. So even as bishops began to be recognized as these leaders of individual churches, no larger connective structure really existed. One of the very first examples we have of a leader, he doesn't even call himself a bishop, although later tradition remembers him as this, Clement of Rome, writing at the end of the first century. We had a lecture on him very recently. Clement intervenes essentially in a controversy in the Church of Corinth, another very venerable church, one that had been planted by Paul in preceding generations. And so essentially the idea is churches are getting mediation when they're having internal controversies by fellow churches, but not necessarily because there is one overall structure, i.e. that Clement, as Bishop of Rome, is the Pope, and therefore he gets to tell everybody everywhere what to do. Although later, the fact that a papacy did develop, this became a very important early precedent for that kind of papal preeminence and later primacy. So within this diversity, though, by the end of the first century and into the second century, there continued to be, as I say, these Jewish Christian groups, potentially the heirs of the Jamesian church, the church that had been led by James, the brother of Jesus, in the 50s and the 40s of the first century. And this ongoing view that the law of Moses continued to be important in Christianity is reflected in some of our earliest texts like the Gospel of Matthew, the Didache, the letters of James and Jude. They indicate that some Jewish Christians continued to observe Mosaic law through the end of the first century. Later tradition states that before Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans in the year 70, the Jamesian church fled north and across the Jordan River to a city called Pella, which is part of the Decapolis, that is to say, Hellenistic cities in Roman Syria. And as of the 4th century, Pella and the Decapolis were still seen as a center for groups like the Ebionites, and other Jewish Christian groups, as the Proto-Orthodox leaders were identifying them. So according to Origen, the Ebionites took their name from the Hebrew word Ebionim, meaning the poor, because they regarded voluntary poverty as a blessing. And Paul had been talking about the church that James led. He was saying, I'm taking up a donation for the poor of Jerusalem. And so that term, Ebionite, anyway, seems to spell a connection potentially with the Jamesian church. Other Jewish Christian groups that continued on called themselves Nazarenes, probably derived from Jesus' epithet of Nazareth. And like I say, these Jewish Christian groups continued to adhere to certain rules that they'd inherited from the Mosaic Code. Centuries past, the majority of Christians, which were mostly in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th centuries, are mostly Gentile in origin, and have not been practicing any part of the Mosaic Code. And indeed, as they start to decide that, based on writings of Paul and other writers, that Christians shouldn't be doing that, and they start to think incorrectly that Jewish Christians had started doing that because they are Judaizers, in other words, that they're actually causing the change. Meanwhile, there's a lot of diversity in early Christianity at the other end of the spectrum. So while some groups are continuing to focus on the Jewish inheritance, others were electing to reject Christianity's Jewish inheritance, including tossing out the Hebrew Bible, what other Christians are regarding the Old Testament. And so these included Gnostic thinkers whose religion emphasized attaining personal knowledge about the true universe, and that finding out that knowledge was essential to salvation. So we get the word Gnostic from the Greek word gnostikos, meaning having knowledge. And like the Gnostics, Marcion of Sinope, our topic for tonight, was very keen to reject the Hebrew Bible and Christianity's Jewish inheritance. That said, he does not seem to have been persuaded, particularly by the secret gnosis of the Gnostics, but he has his own ideas. So his rivals, the Proto-Orthodox, often lump him together as a Gnostic, and there are some overlap in ideas, but he rejects the central component that we've always talked about in Gnosticism, which is to say these elaborate scriptural cosmogonies, these stories of how the universe is created based on the true spiritual God, the monad, emanating aeon after aeon, these different almost Platonic form-like divine beings. So after Marcion's ideas ended up getting rejected by Proto-Orthodox leaders, Marcion began to organize his own church network, what we call the Marcionite Church. And we have kind of a portrait here originally, or we would have had a portrait here of Marcion interacting with John the Beloved, John the Apostle. But of course, when you end up getting labeled as a heretic, all of the people who preserve any texts or images of you, like the Proto-Orthodox and later Orthodox Imperial Church that became the state religion of the Roman Empire, people then end up defacing, your image, if not just destroying the book. So, to some extent, Marcion's success at organizing his own church network, that may have been one of the major points of impetus for his opponents, these emerging Proto-Orthodox leaders, these bishops, to strengthen their own network of churches. So in some ways, a church that doesn't have any structure or hierarchy starts to develop it a lot more because there is a rival opposing structure that is taking shape under Marcion's leadership. And in addition to that effect on Christianity in general, Marcion is also credited with being the very first Christian to draw up a list or canon of books that he considered authoritative. That is to say, what books should be included in the Christian Bible. And by doing this, Marcion seems to have inspired his rivals to create their own lists, which eventually developed into the Orthodox canon of the New Testament. So Marcion was especially exclusive in his canon, so he restricted it to a single gospel, the Gospel of Marcion, which is similar to a gospel that we attribute to Luke. In addition to that, 10 letters of Paul are part of Marcion's gospel. All other Gospels, both the ones that made it into the New Testament, all the ones that didn't make it into the New Testament, some of which weren't written yet, all of the letters that made it into the New Testament, all of the books of Acts, all of the apocalypses, they are not included in Marcion's canon. And Marcion further excluded the entire Hebrew Bible, what other Christians understand as the Old Testament, but which Marcion and his church just formally reject. And so Marcion, in doing this, I think creates a very Paul-focused canon. Paul, in his writings, had rejected observance of Jewish law. Marcion takes this a big step further, rejecting Jewish scripture and rejecting the God of the Old Testament, as we'll see. And so, like I say, even though after Marcion there starts to emerge a Marcionite structure, a proto-Orthodox structure, there continued to be Ebionite, Nazarene, other Jewish Christian groups, and generally speaking, not as their own separate churches, but as groups within these structures, Gnostic Christianity, the diversity of Christianity that existed in the middle of the 2nd century had a wide range in terms of deciding what to do about the Jewish inheritance. From, on the one hand, the Ebionites on the one end of the spectrum, who very much embrace it and focus on it, to Marcion and the Gnostics on the other end, which are essentially rejecting it, to the squishy middle, the proto-Orthodox, who are wanting to retain it, but understand it primarily symbolically and typologically as a precursor to Christ and how we understand Christ, but not to be part of a lived experience. In other words, the laws and strictures are not to be lived. And so, nevertheless, there's a huge overlap in all of these. There wasn't essentially a corporate structure that has an org chart, a bunch of property that they all own. Almost all Christians are still meeting in house churches and so forth at this stage. So why do some Christians, some early Christians, want to throw away the Old Testament? Why do they want to get rid of this component of the Jewish inheritance? Well, if you've ever read the Hebrew Bible closely, the Lord, which is the shorthand that is used anywhere the text says Yahweh, Yahweh is not always written as the most sympathetic character. For example, when there's a place in Genesis where Yahweh regrets creating humanity. So we read in Genesis 6, Yahweh saw that the wickedness of humans was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made humans on earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So this is a God that seems to have made a mistake and regrets it and is fickle about it. And so the Lord says, I will blot out from the earth the humans I've created, people together with animals and creeping things and the birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. So having made this plan, God goes ahead with it and kills every human and everything on earth except a tiny band of refugees preserved on Noah's Ark. So Yahweh blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, human beings and animals and creeping things and the birds of the air. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left and those with him on the ark. And so, although somewhere along the line people decided that this story was a wonderful thing to tell children, it really does describe a God who commits a pretty horrific act of destruction. And so if we don't focus on all of the happy animals on the little boat, and instead we focus on all of the much greater multitude of animals and people that are left behind, the world being destroyed is a kind of thing that, of course, petty polytheistic gods, the gods of Mesopotamia, the gods of ancient Greece, all sorts of pantheons do. But in Genesis, it's also a thing that Yahweh does. So, we have an image here, an engraving from the 19th century of a giant cat trying to save her cub and her kitten or whatever, a lioness, trying to save that from her mouth. Parents who are dying, trying to save their children. Of course, it'll all be for naught since that little rock is going to be covered. Probably a mountaintop is going to be covered soon. So, let's go to another example. To free the children of Israel from bondage in Egypt, Yahweh sends Moses to order Pharaoh to let them go. Each time Pharaoh refuses, God sends a plague. These are very graphically portrayed in Ridley Scott's Exodus, Gods and Kings, this film that we have on the schedule for Leandro and I to watch and review. I haven't watched it yet, but I watched some screen clips of the different plagues, which are pretty graphic. So if you've read Exodus closely, you'll also notice something unusual every time Moses goes back after one of these plagues to give Pharaoh another chance to give in and let the people go. For example, after all of those locusts cover all Egypt, devour every plant, and leave everyone to starve, we read in Exodus 10 that Pharaoh hurriedly summoned Moses and Aaron, his brother, and said, "I have sinned against Yahweh, your God, and against you. Do forgive my sin this once and pray to the Lord your God, that at least he will remove this deadly thing from me." So, Pharaoh capitulates and recognizes Moses' God as God and asks him to, forgive him and so forth. So when he went out from so Moses went out from Pharaoh and prayed to the Lord. Then the Lord changed the wind into a very strong west wind, which lifted the locusts and drove them out of Egypt into the Red Sea, and not a single locust was left in all of the country of Egypt. Okay, so far so good. Pharaoh has repented, and Egypt is free now of the locusts. But the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go. So the Lord hardened Pharaoh's hearts. So on the one hand, God is the one bringing the destruction. And it's not just on Pharaoh and the Egyptian elite, it's the entire country. Every single shred of vegetation has been eaten by these locusts. Everybody, all the poorest people, are obviously going to go hungry. So as Pharaoh looks ready to cave in, God is the one who then hardens his heart. So why is God doing that? Well, in the text of Exodus, God explains himself to Moses. So we read earlier in chapter 10, the Lord said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his officials, in order that I may show these signs of mine among them, in order that you may tell your children and grandchildren how I made fools of the Egyptians and what signs I am doing among them, so that you may know that I am the Lord." So, ultimately all of the suffering and death here is going to be worth it, because future generations of Israelites are going to be able to make fun of their Egyptian neighbors, because it's very clear that Yahweh is much more powerful than the gods of all of Egypt, all the gods in Egypt, and therefore Yahweh must be God. So there's the rationale for hardening Pharaoh's heart. So this reminds me also, the next thing reminds me, that Yahweh does reminds me of something from Greek mythology. So in one of the precursor story to the Iliad, three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, are competing over a golden apple that is thrown into their midst by the goddess Discord, and the apple says, "To the fairest," and each of these three goddesses claims to be the fairest. Zeus is wise enough not to judge between his wife and two semi-daughters, depending on how you count them, three Olympian goddesses, and so he instead suggests that they have a prince of Troy, Paris, judge for them. And of course, none of them play fair. Each of them offers a bribe to Paris. So Hera offers to make Paris the king of Europe. She's going to give him all of the power. Athena offers him wisdom, which is what God gives to Solomon when Solomon is given the opportunity to ask for anything. So Athena will give him wisdom, and on top of that, even skill in war, since she's a goddess of both. But Aphrodite offers Paris love with the most beautiful woman in the world, and him being a young man, that's what he decides he wants. But of course, Aphrodite's bribe comes with a pretty big string attached, as the world's most beautiful woman is already married to the king of Sparta. And so in going and seizing her, carrying her off with him back to Troy, it sparks the Trojan War and ultimately ends up getting Paris himself killed in the end, and just the destruction of his entire city and people and so forth. So the land that God promises to the Israelites in Exodus as they're leaving, the promised land, that comes with a similarly problematic set of strings. So Moses is not able to enter the promised land, but God shows it to them after the Israelites have been wandering 40 years in the wilderness. And it turns out the promised land is already inhabited and owned by plenty of other people. So not to worry, just as Hera's promise to Paris that she would make him king of Europe, that probably would have come with a whole bunch of legwork on Paris's part, as he would have to go around and conquer Europe. God has a plan to sort out the whole situation in the promised land, as he tells Moses in the book of Deuteronomy, where we read, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you're about to enter and occupy, he clears away many nations before you. The Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, 7 nations much more numerous and mightier than you. And when the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must utterly destroy them. So make no covenant with them, show them no mercy, do not intermarry with them, giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons, for that would turn away your children from following me and to serve other gods. Then the anger of the Lord would be kindled against you, and he would destroy you quickly. But this is how you must deal with them. Break down their altars, smash their pillars, cut down their sacred poles, burn their idols with fire, for you're a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the peoples on the earth to be his people, his treasured possession. So God orders in Deuteronomy what would today be called genocide. Obviously, it's before that concept has been it's anachronistic, but in any event, the people, the children of Israel, called to utterly destroy all of the current inhabitants of the promised land, the land of Canaan, and they're to show no mercy. That includes wiping out all the people and also their culture, the artifacts of their religion, the statues of their gods, altars, their Asherah poles, and everything else. So according to the book of Joshua, huge numbers of Canaanites are slaughtered, and the fighting continues on through the era of Israel's judges and kings, as told in the book of Judges and then Samuel and Kings. And so we read in 1 Samuel that the prophet Samuel said to the very first of Israel's kings, Saul, "The Lord sent me to anoint you king over his people Israel. Now therefore listen to the words of the Lord. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I will punish the Amalekites for what they did in opposing the Israelites when they came up out of Egypt. Now go and attack Amalek and utterly destroy all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey." So, we also are going to utterly destroy the Amalekites now under King Saul. So armed with God's explicit order to kill everyone, even the Amalekite babies, King Saul leads some 10,000 soldiers, according to the Bible anyway, and defeats the Amalekites in battle. And so Saul took King Agag of the Amalekites alive, but then he utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. Saul and the people spared King Agag and the best of the sheep and of the cattle and of the fatted calves and the lambs, and all that was valuable, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless, they utterly destroyed. So, although Saul seemingly kills all the people except the king, King Agag, for some reason, he decides, well, it would pretty much be a waste to destroy all this really good livestock and other valuable property. But it turns out Yahweh is very serious about the whole utterly destroy part of his plan for the promised land. In the very next verse we read, the word of the Lord came now to Samuel. I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not carried out my commands. And so that makes Samuel angry. He cries out to the Lord all night. And Saul's policy of mostly utterly destroying everything is clearly out of alignment with God's utterly destroy commandments. And so, given God's one strike you're out policy, he now regrets his prior decision of making Saul king, and he immediately has Samuel seek out a new king. And of course, this is where we have the story of David and Goliath, and this youth ends up getting anointed king in secret by Samuel, which ultimately ends up leading to a civil war as Saul continues to have all of the power and authority of the exterior authority of the state and everything, but David has God's favor. So, if you have wanted to come to the defense of the God of the Old Testament in some of these examples that I'm given, you might propose the idea, well, maybe all of those antediluvian peoples who were destroyed in the flood, maybe the Egyptians, the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Amorites, maybe those people are all really, really wicked, and they deserve utter destruction, including their babies and animals. But the God of the Old Testament also lets entirely innocent people suffer too, as we famously read in the book of Job. So one day we read in Job chapter 1, the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser, or the Satan, also came among them. And the Lord said to the accuser, have you considered my servant Job? There is no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil. So God himself says Job is blameless, so he's the opposite of wicked, he's the opposite of deserving of a punishment. But Satan here, this person who has the role in the court of God of the accuser, gives a counter to this example, arguing that Job only loves God and worships him because God has given him so many blessings, and if he lost all of those blessings, Job would change his tune. So God, knowing better, nevertheless responds, the Lord said to the accuser, very well, all that Job has is in your power, only don't stretch your hand out against him, his body, his person, his health. So the accuser went down from the presence of the Lord, and in the very next verse we read, one day when Job's sons and daughters were eating and drinking wine in the eldest brother's house, a messenger came to Job and said, the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding beside them, and then the Sabaeans fell on them and carried them off and killed the servants with the edge of the sword, and I alone have escaped to tell you. And while that messenger was still speaking, another ran up and said, the fire of God fell from heaven and burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them, and I alone have escaped. And there continue to be more and more messengers who immediately run up and say all of these different natural and horrible enemies, attacking calamities, have ended up destroying all of Job's property and more importantly, killing all of Job's children and their families. So since the loss of the children or property fails to turn Job against God, the Satan goes back to God, who subsequently authorizes him to afflict Job with terrible illnesses, suffering, and pain. And this still doesn't turn Job, but what it sort of does show is that God is allowing, in the book of Job anyway, horrific suffering on someone who is entirely not deserving of it. And so when in the very end, Job is able to confront the Lord and ask him why he has been made to suffer, the Lord answers him out of a whirlwind, and he gives this incredible speech of the cosmic God who has such an infinite plans that humans are essentially inconsequential. God says, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. And while this is an amazing passage, it doesn't buy a lot of sympathy, I think, for God and God's position in all of this. And so, in any event, this is a God of the Old Testament that is starting to get a little bit of a pattern as we're seeing it. And even if we, just finally put a bow on this behavior and we credit, okay, well, God has big cosmic fish to fry, and so obviously a universal flood is a big deal, as is, the whirlwind creating the earth, etc. But we read in the book of 2 Kings, shortly after the great prophet Elijah is taken away in a chariot of fire and is succeeded by a new prophet Elisha, the people who now have a new prophet that they don't know as much about are not immediately impressed. So when in 2 Kings we read that Elisha went up from the city of Jericho to the city of Bethel, and while he was going up, some small boys came out of the city and they jeered at him, saying, go away, bald head, as kids are wont to do. And so when Elisha turned around and saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. And then 2 she-bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the boys. So here's a 15th century illustration of Elijah cursing the children who were subsequently mauled by bears. So, the God of the Old Testament, offering this immediate and extreme punishment for children who tease a prophet is, again, not sympathetic. So when we read all of these things in composite, the God of the Old Testament reveals a pattern of behaviors that are uncomfortable. So you can see, and many Christians to this day are very uncomfortable with all of these, especially when they read these stories literally and imagine that any of them, or imagine that they actually happened as if they were history, instead of reading them in some kind of symbolic sense, as so many Christians in antiquity and the Middle Ages did. Nevertheless, like I say, this is one of the reasons why so many early Christians were looking at this inheritance and thinking, well, we have a couple options. One of those options is what Plato suggested for Greek mythology, which is to say, ban it from his Utopia. Likewise, maybe we should get rid of these texts from our religion. So if we contrast all of that composite in the Old Testament, Christians had a different understanding of their God from New Testament texts. So for example, in the Gospel of John, Jesus tells a Pharisee named Nicodemus that God so loved the world, he gave his only Son, so that everyone who believes in him may not perish, but may have eternal life. Indeed, God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that the world might be saved through him. So, according to Jesus here in the Gospel of John, God's motivation towards the world, towards all of creation, is love. And his ultimate plan, if it works out, is universal salvation by sending the Son into the world. And this theme is continued by the author of the first epistle of John, who says, "Beloved, let us love one another, because love is from God. And everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. And whoever does not love whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love. God's love was revealed among us in this way. God sent his only Son into the world so that we might live through him." So this quotation goes on as the author develops this theme that God is love itself, effectively arguing that Christians can understand God in the same way Platonists understand the Platonic form of love, or for Plato, the highest one is the form of the good. So, like I say, if you have been troubled by these seemingly different portraits of God, you're not the first Christian to pick up on the contrasts. And so within that diversity of early Christianity, Gnostic Christians proposed an explanation. They argued that the God of the Old Testament, the God as described in all of the different books of the Old Testament, is in fact not the true God, but is instead a demiurge, a craftsman God, like like Plato talks about, but nevertheless is one that is responsible for a very flawed material world. And Gnostics believed that there is a true spiritual world, an immaterial world, that is created by a true spiritual God, the unseen, unknowable source or monad. So there are, at the minimum, these two gods in Gnosticism, the true source, the monad, and the malevolent, flawed material god, Yaldabaoth. And this second god, Yaldabaoth, in his botched material creation, ends up trapping sparks of the divine within material bodies. So something eternal in something degraded and perishable. And for Gnostics, Christ is one of many divine emanations, one of many aeons of the monad, and Christ is the one that is sent into the material world to share all of this thing that I'm just telling you about, the secret gnosis, the secret knowledge of the universe's true form, so that those humans who do possess a divine spark can eventually return to their true spiritual home. And in that sense, the Gnostics are envisioning Christ as the autogenes, or divine self-begotten being. So we've already had a lecture on Valentinus, a brilliant 2nd century thinker who had been the leader of a school in Alexandria, who moved in the 140s to Rome. And Valentinus departs from the original Gnostic myths, this cosmogony that I had, and instead he works to make it more compatible with the Christian writings that are beginning to be seen as authoritative by the early 2nd century. In other words, the emerging canon of the New Testament. A couple weeks ago, we did a lecture on Clement of Rome and his first epistle, one of the most important and earliest texts written by a Christian that didn't make it into the New Testament. And Clement is already just quoting, is incredibly committed to Old Testament texts, but is also quoting sayings of Jesus and so forth. So we're starting to see that that there is a tradition that is becoming authoritative. And we also have in epistles like 2 Peter, not written by the Apostle Peter, but written in his name, potentially from Rome, a writer that has access to all of Paul's letters, or many of Paul's letters, a group of Paul's letters, we don't know exactly which ones, and other texts like the Epistle of Jude and so forth. So these texts are starting to be important, and Valentinus rewrites and reworks a Gnostic myth and creates Valentinianism, a kind of a new form of Gnosticism that is actually very compelling to Christians in the 2nd century, and Valentinus ends up being considered a very, very serious potential, rival by proto-Orthodox leaders like Irenaeus, who write works against him. Valentinus was a contemporary of the proto-Orthodox Christian philosopher Justin Martyr, we also did a recent lecture on, who had also relocated to Rome in the mid of the 2nd century to lead a school there, and so he's a contemporary. Nevertheless, despite how important Justin was, Valentinus' teaching was so influential that Justin's own pupil Tatian is later criticized by 3rd century proto-Orthodox leader like Tertullian for having been tainted by Gnostic ideas. So another person that's present in Rome at this very same time is Marcion. So Marcion relocates to Rome sometime between maybe 135 and 140, the late 130s, and therefore it's contemporary to both Valentinus and Justin. And like Valentinus, Marcion believed that the God of the Old Testament was incompatible with the God revealed in Christ. But unlike Valentinus, Marcion did not adopt and adapt the whole Gnostic cosmogony, the myth of creation with its many emanations, divine aeons, and so forth. And so if we just place ourselves on the first centuries of early Christianity with this chronology, all of the dates of which are mostly conjectural. So at the middle of the early first century, or when we have the early Jesus movement active with folks like John the Baptist and Jesus, who end up being executed, followed in Jerusalem by Jesus' brother James, who is alive until he himself is executed by stoning. And simultaneously with James is Paul's activity. Then we have the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. We have the traditional dates for the canonical Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. And that is happening kind of simultaneously from when Clement of Rome, who we talked about, was active in his writing and work. And then the other apostolic fathers, Ignatius of Antioch, Papias of Hierapolis, Polycarp of Smyrna. And then we get, with Polycarp living a little bit longer than the others, to this period of time that we're talking about in Rome, when we have Marcion, Valentinus, and Justin Martyr. And then we have Justin's studentation, and then some of the other proto-Orthodox leaders, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Tertullian, Cyprian, Eusebius, and so forth, and the conversion of Constantine, and ultimately there, at the end of this period, the Council of Nicaea, when the proto-Orthodox community organizes as the church that the Emperor Constantine patronizes and finally creates into a single institution, or starts to. All right, so for centuries, Gnosticism was largely only known from the writings of proto-Orthodox critics like Irenaeus of Lyon and Tertullian, who wrote books against what they saw and labeled as a heresy. So this changed, as we know, with the discovery of a whole collection of Gnostic texts included in the library of Nag Hammadi, Egypt, in the middle of the 20th century. And that recovery has allowed us to see what Gnostics themselves believed, and we also see from that it's quite a diverse group. Grab some water. Unfortunately, the same is not true for Marcionism. So although Marcionism lingered on in places like Anatolia, Syria, and Central Asia, those aren't as good as lingering in Egypt, where you can go out into the desert and bury a jar full of scrolls and they'll survive. So because we lack Marcion's own writing, essentially all of the details of his life and teachings are largely drawn from the proto-Orthodox detractors, folks like Irenaeus, who singled out Marcion as a particular enemy, and folks like Tertullian, who wrote an entire book or a series of books against Marcion. And so what can we know? So from their detractors, including a 4th century bishop, Epiphanius of Salamis, a city on the island of Cyprus, Epiphanius says that Marcion was the wealthy son of a bishop of Sinope, a city on the coast of the Black Sea in the Roman province of Pontus. And so people have said this is likely Bishop Philologus of Sinope, but anyway, this is what a surmise, maybe not. Anyways, a guy from Sinope. The 2nd century writer Rhodo, who was a student of Tatian, who was that student of Justin Martyr, Rhodo wrote a book against Marcionism in which he says Marcion was a mariner, and Tertullian says Marcion was a shipmaster. And so it's possible that Marcion, is involved, he's a ship owner or a merchant who was involved in trade, and this may be a source of the great wealth that his detractors identify with him. So lots and lots of early Christians were very poor, but we now are starting to get to a place where people with more wealth are part of the movement in the middle of the 2nd century, which is why we're getting more texts. Sometime, like I say, at the end of the 130s, Marcion moved to Rome. And when he got there, he made a very large donation to the congregation that is established in the city. So this amounted to 200,000 sesterces. And well, it's difficult to say what that means in modern money. In the era itself, in the 2nd century, it was the equivalent of paying 200 Roman legionnaires their annual salary. So that's a lot of money. It's not, it's not billions, but it's maybe, in the maybe millions. Anyway, whatever. It's hard to do with our current money because things are so different. Marcion hoped to convince elders of the church to adopt his views about the Hebrew Bible and also the God that the Hebrew Bible describes. And this is in part because, in contrast to proto-Orthodox leaders who understood the Hebrew Bible typologically, in other words, they read it effectively as a symbolic account prefiguring the truth of Christ in the cosmos, and were able to explain away difficult readings for that in that way, Marcion preferred to read the Bible, quite literally as something that happened pretty much as described, as if it were history. So for example, in the Eden story, after Adam and Eve have disobeyed Yahweh, we read in Genesis chapter 3 that Adam and Eve heard the sound of the Lord God walking in the garden at the time of the evening breeze. And the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called to the man and said to him, "Where are you?" So the implication of the text here, and Marcion points this out, is that Yahweh, the God of the Hebrew Bible, is a limited physical God whose footsteps can make noise as he walks around, who lacks omniscience. How can he be a universal God if two humans are effectively able to hide from him and he has to ask, "Where are you?" So for Marcion, passages like this show that the God of the Old Testament can't be the God that Jesus spoke of. How can he be the universal God? And of course, this same passage we saw was used by Philo of Alexandria, not a Christian, but a Hellenized Jewish philosopher from the first half of the 1st century, who argued and said, let no one be so idiotic as to read this story literally or understand it literally as if God, has feet or anything like that. He interprets all such texts like this symbolically or allegorically, and that's the same way that proto-Orthodox leaders continue to read it. Marcion does not deny the existence of Yahweh. So essentially he sees the Hebrew Bible as effectively an accurate history. But he argued that the Old Testament itself, because he read it literally, proves that Yahweh is a lesser, jealous, tribal God of the Jews. And if you go through all of his laws, like an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth, those laws, the law of Moses, is based on a kind of legalistic, primitive, reciprocal justice. And therefore, this God is entirely focused on punishing mankind for sins by meting out suffering and death, like poor Job received, the destruction of the cities of the plain in Genesis, the flood, the Canaanites, every other thing. A vengeful, tribal, merciless deity. So, in a now lost text entitled The Antitheses, Marcion contrasts Yahweh, the flawed, material Old Testament God, with the God that Jesus revealed, an immaterial, universal God of love and compassion who looks upon humanity with mercy. So, like the Gnostics, like I say, Marcion identifies Yahweh with Plato's demiurge, but unlike them, his system is ditheistic. In other words, two gods, the good spiritual God and the bad material God. Gnosticism, of course, includes all sorts of other divine beings, the many aeons that are emanated from the monad. So, the proto-Orthodox writer Hippolytus of Rome, who's active at the end of the 2nd, beginning of the 3rd century, reports that Marcion taught Christ was revealed as a man, though not a man. And so the implication is that Marcion, here and elsewhere, that Marcion Marcionism taught that Jesus' incarnation is not real and physical and material. It's docetic, and that we get that word from the Greek word dokein, meaning seem. And so in other words, Jesus' body only seems to be material, and thus he did not really die on the cross. The body is an illusion. And Marcion also is very clear that Jesus was not the Jewish Messiah, but was instead the son of this true God, the spiritual God from whom Marcion sometimes calls the alien God or the stranger God, because this God is alien and a stranger in the sense that he's not really associated with the material world. It's this Yahweh is involved in this flawed creation of the material world. But we can connect now to the spiritual God. Marcion further rejected the idea, like I say, that Jesus was physically born to a human mother. And so, like I say, he sees him as a holy spiritual being. And so in keeping with this belief, the Gospel of Marcion does not begin with a nativity story, the way the Gospel of Matthew or the Gospel of Luke do. Instead, as reconstructed from quotations in Tertullian and Epiphanius, Marcion's Gospel began in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea. Jesus descended into Capernaum, a city in Galilee, and was teaching on the Sabbath day. So just as Jesus ascends to heaven at the end of his ministry in the Gospel of Luke, in Marcion's Gospel, he also descends from heaven to earth at the very start of his ministry. And so this is part then of Marcion's canon, the Evangelicon, the Gospel of Marcion as we call it, and then, like we said, 10 letters of Paul, which he called the Apostolicon. And among those are essentially all of the letters that we now have in the canon that we think that scholars agree are written by the historical Paul. Two of the two disputed letters, Colossians and 2 Thessalonians. And then there's another letter in Marcion's canon called the letter to the Laodiceans, but it's not clear which letter is meant there. So there is a letter to the Laodiceans that we have a copy of that doesn't make it into, didn't make it into the Bible, but it's a pretty late one, so probably written after this time, so it's probably not the same one. And it's also possible that the letter to the Ephesians is not actually, didn't actually have that name originally attached to it. And so it's possible that Marcion is meaning Ephesians, but Ephesians is also one of the disputed letters anyway. And so he also has not included 1st and 2nd Timothy or Titus, which most scholars today think are anachronistic to Paul, and so therefore not written by him. And he doesn't include Hebrews, which is an anonymous text that people later thought might be a Pauline text, but it actually is not. It's written by a different author. So Marcion's canon and Marcion's Gospel. So ultimately, the mid-century Christian church at Rome, despite getting this big donation, they end up rejecting Marcion and also Valentinus, preferring to side with proto-Orthodox leaders like Justin Martyr. And in part, we can see why this community maybe isn't as excited about rejecting the entire Old Testament. If we look back again at this earlier letter of Clement of Rome that is so steeped in quoting the Old Testament to understand Christian distinctives. So why did he leave? So later proto-Orthodox leaders claimed that Marcion was excommunicated for having seduced a virgin, but a lot of scholars have pointed out that this actually may be just a metaphor for attempting to sway the Church of Rome. So in other words, the Roman Church was like a virgin, and Marcion tried to woo them with his heresy from the Orthodox perspective and so forth. So Marcion, rebuffed but undaunted, returned to his place of origin, Anatolia, modern Turkey, and he began organizing a network of like-minded bishops, creating what effectively becomes a Marcionite church. And this Marcionite church is very stern and has a real strict asceticism to it. And it relates to their rejection of the material world. So if the material world is the creation of, the flawed material God, Yahweh, and our true, the true God is actually alien to it, and Christ is a spiritual messenger from that God, and we're trying to go back to it. Our asceticism should be, based on getting rid of anything material and not having any connections to the material world. And so for this reason, Marcionites renounce eating meat other than fish, so they're pescatarians. They have other special good foods that they eat. They reject drinking wine. And reportedly, instead of performing the Eucharist with bread and wine, they do it with bread and water. Marcion, in addition, barred members of his community from marriage. So marriage was essentially seen as lust, adultery, and so on, and also from sexual intercourse, because it was important to prevent the propagation of anything more into this flawed material world. We need to renounce the world, get rid of all worldly things entirely. So if you were already married before you became a Marcionite, you have to take a vow of celibacy. And indeed, only disciples who took a vow of celibacy were given the sacrament of baptism and admitted into full communion in the Marcionite church. And then any disciples who lapsed, so for example, if there's a Roman persecution and the Romans say, if you just renounce Christ, and just raise this little offering before the genius of the emperor, then we won't kill you. If somebody does that, they would not ever be readmitted to the Marcionite church anyway. And we also have a source that says, instead of in communion in the Eucharist, instead of the formula where you say, "This is my body," Marcionites use the formula, "This is the figure. This is a figure of my body." So a symbol of my body. So this is a very symbolic thing, not anything real or material, because they're very anti the material world. Of course, as we've seen in other lectures, when we look at some of the other dualist sects that are religions that are anti-material, anytime you prohibit natural reproduction, that's usually not a winning strategy for a religion's survival. But the decks are also stacked for the Marcionites, because proto-Orthodox leaders, and then later the imperial Roman Church that made it its business to stamp out heresies. They certainly did not help with the survival of Marcionitism and the Marcionite Church. Both reacted very strongly against the Marcionites. Irenaeus wrote against all of Marcion's ideas, and like I said, Tertullian, other proto-Orthodox and early Orthodox writers singled him out. So in the West, Marcionite Church died out by the 4th century. It lingered a little longer in the East, and then continued another few centuries within the Sassanid, the Persian Empire, and its successors. So there is a survival, apparently, in the Middle East, and especially Central Asia in the Muslim world. So medieval Muslim accounts observe the ongoing existence of Marcioniya, Marcionism, and they especially identify it, at the very end in Khorasan, that is to say, Central Asia. And so the 10th century Muslim polymath al-Masudi says that in his day, Marcionites believed in two principles, good and evil, and justice is a third principle between these two. So it doesn't sound exactly like Marcionism at the time of Marcion, but it does, there is a dualism in in Marcion's theology. So it's possible, people have suggested that it's possible that there's been some ongoing changes and maybe that this is already kind of a neo-Marcionism. But in any event, it doesn't last much longer than in the Central Middle Ages, as Islam is also not the, at a certain point, not the most hospitable environment for both Marcionism and the Manichees, who are also surviving in the same kind of area. So apparently there have been Marcionite revival churches. So I haven't gone through the site very closely, but I just found Marcionite Church of Christ.org, which has a big website that seems pretty impressive and seems to indicate that they are representing a revival of Marcionism. And Marcion has had a lot of interest on the internet lately because there is renewed, there's been a renewed scholarly hypothesis that has gotten, a lot of talking about. And so this relates to the Gospel of Marcion and the Gospel of Luke. These books, the Gospel of Marcion and the Gospel of Luke, are textually dependent on each other, so there is a direct relationship between them. But the question is, what is the relationship? So proto-Orthodox authors who had access to Marcion's Gospel before it was lost, before they suppressed it, they noted that it was very closely related to the Gospel of Luke. And so Tertullian, who wrote all those books against Marcion, he states anyway that Marcion had edited a version of Luke, and that those edits expunged all of the things that opposed Marcion's view. So anything that was in Luke that opposed what Marcion believes is gotten rid of, but that Marcion retained those things that accorded with his opinion. So that's the proto-Orthodox take from antiquity. And again, like I say, although Marcion's Gospel is lost, because Tertullian and other proto-Orthodox leaders very extensively quoted it, that has allowed for modern scholars to compare it with Luke. And so if we realize, for example, or the ancient observers also tell us that while the Gospel of Luke begins with 2 chapters that tell Luke's nativity story, Luke's Christmas story, and so this is the one that has the shepherds come to find Jesus in a manger because there's no room for him in the inn, as opposed to the Matthew Christmas story, which has wise men, magi from the east following a star, and Herod and the massacre of the infants story. So in other words, there's one of the 2 Christmas stories, the Lucan Christmas story. Marcion's Gospel, even though it's related to Luke, lacks this story and begins, as we read earlier, with the idea that Jesus descended from heaven to go to Galilee, to the city of Capernaum. So if we look at the related texts, we saw that Marcion's Gospel, as reconstructed, begins in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, Pontius Pilate being governor of Judea. Jesus descended into Capernaum, a city of Galilee, and was teaching on the Sabbath day. So this corresponds, with the beginning of the 3rd chapter of Luke, so after the nativity story. And so in Luke we read, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, and then there's additional information. And Herod was ruler of Galilee, and his brother Philip, ruler of the region of Iturea, and Trachonitis and Lysanias was the ruler of Abilene. During the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas, the word of God came to John the Baptist, son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. And so then the Gospel of Luke, in the rest of chapter 3, tells the story of Jesus' baptism by John, Jesus' temptation by the devil in the wilderness, and so forth. And then in the next chapter, we see he went down to Capernaum, a city in Galilee, and was teaching them on the Sabbath. And so that's where, it follows in the rest of the part from Gospel of Marcion. So presumably a big section omitted, edited out, or if they're as the proto-Orthodox would have it anyway. So the general scholarly consensus today agrees with the admittedly partisan testimony of these early ancient proto-Orthodox witnesses. So, for example, they cite hostility towards the Hebrew Bible as an explanation of why Marcion would edit out references to the prophets. So the first century, the New Testament word for the Hebrew Bible is the law and the prophets. And so in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, Jesus says, "O foolish and slow of heart to believe that the prophets to believe in all that the prophets have spoken." The corresponding part of the Gospel of Marcion has, "O foolish and hard of heart to believe in all that I have told you." So eliminating prophets if it's an edit. A similar edit eliminates Jesus calling God Lord of heaven and earth, which would not be true of Marcion's, real spiritual God, the true God, the alien God, who is not the Lord of earth. The flawed God is the Lord of earth. And so in Luke chapter 10, we read, "At the very hour Jesus rejoiced in the Holy Spirit and said, 'I thank you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you've hidden these things from the wise.'" And that corresponding part in the Gospel of Marcion says, "I thank you, Heavenly Father," not Father, Lord of heaven and earth. He's not the Lord of earth for Marcionism. So rather than being charged with being the Jewish Messiah, as in Luke when Jesus is arrested, in Marcion's Gospel, Jesus is charged with destroying the law and the prophets. In other words, the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, that Marcion is an enemy of, Jesus is also an enemy of it, and that's the cause of his arrest. So in Luke chapter 23, we read, "They began to accuse Jesus, saying, 'We found this man inciting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king.'" The corresponding part in Marcion's Gospel says, "They began to accuse him, saying, 'We found this man perverting our nation and destroying the law and the prophets.'" So all of these kinds of instances, there's a rationale for why Marcion, in beginning with a Gospel of Luke that's largely like the one we have, might edit some things out and make some changes. So, like I say, that's the current consensus. The Gospel of Luke, composed by an anonymous author as the first half of a two-part book, Luke Acts, sometime at the end of the first century, maybe the 80s, maybe the 90s, and then in the middle of the second century, Marcion making his own gospel as an edited version, cutting out some things, fixing some things so that it accords more with his views. And so while this wide spectrum of views, while the wide spectrum of views within biblical studies makes complete consensus impossible, there are people who have, I think, very serious commitments, including people who are very religious, who want to believe in biblical inerrancy and so forth. But nevertheless, most scholars date, like I say, the Gospel of Luke to the end of the first century and date Marcion's Gospel to the time he spent in Rome, in other words, the mid-second. And so in this understanding, Marcion edited a version of Luke to better align with his own theology. However, there is a new hypothesis. This is the hypothesis of the priority of Marcion. And this has especially been made within the last few decades. A handful of biblical scholars have proposed that Marcion composed the original gospel, and then proto-Orthodox leaders later edited into the text, expanding it into Luke, and actually writing the whole text of Acts as a companion piece. And if we follow this hypothesis, it requires redating the Gospel of Luke from the late first century to the mid to late second century. So Luke Acts becomes a very late book compared to as it's traditionally understood. Another thing that happens is it shows that would make Marcion's influence on all of history, on Christianity, just spectacular. Not only is he the guy who sort of proposes the idea of a canon, not only is he the guy who really starts organizing a network of bishops that cause the proto-Orthodox to get their act together and start condemning heretics and so forth, or what they think of as heretics. He also is the guy who started Christians off in the gospel writing business, according to this hypothesis. So proponents of Marcion priority argue that Marcion's gospel reflects a simpler, more concise version of the text. And so usually when we have, let's say, two readings of different sayings, the simpler, more difficult reading is often, preferred. In other words, we think that that's a more ancient one because as things continue to be transmitted, people want to add words, make them easier to understand, make them less harsh, and so forth. And so, for example, in what corresponds to a passage in Luke chapter 9, where the Gospel of Luke reads, "O faithless and perverse generation, how long will I be with you and endure you?" There's a much simpler corresponding saying in the Gospel of Marcion, "Faithless generation, how long must I put up with you?" So there isn't any particular reason for Marcion to delete phrases like this. It's not fixing the text for his theology. And as I say, often when someone is going through and editing sayings, they actually add things and expand them as opposed to making them more concise. Another one of these corresponds with a passage in Luke chapter 12. So that slave who knew what his master wanted but did not prepare himself or do what was wanted will receive a severe beating. But a much simpler variant corresponds in the section in the Gospel of Marcion. For the slave who knew yet did not act will be flogged many times. So like I say, Marcion's version of the saying is much simpler and it lacks this kind of hedging words. So we don't want to just, if we want to say the slave who knew yet did not act will be flogged, now this is saying who knew, what did he know? What his master wanted. And he didn't prepare himself to do what was wanted, he will be flogged. So in other words, this is much more explained in the Gospel of Luke. And in the same kinds of analysis of sayings, we've done this when we looked at our analysis of the Gospel of Thomas, this really important text from the Nag Hammadi library that a bunch of scholars have argued preserves an own independent sayings of Jesus document that have been added to over time, but some of which, because they're so simple, maybe reflect an authentic tradition or a very old tradition. And so anyway, the Gospel of Marcion seems to be doing that same thing that we gave the Gospel of Thomas a lot of credit for, and have suggested that maybe it's earlier than other people might want to date it. But proposing that Luke is dependent on Marcion is not all by itself an isolated issue, because Luke also shares literary dependence with the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of Matthew. And so if you open Luke up, you also have to explain and say that Luke is actually dependent on Marcion's gospel. Then you have to overturn the entire general hypothesis of how all three of the synoptic gospels are formed. And the standard hypothesis for that is the two-source hypothesis, the idea that the earliest gospel, Mark, is the one that actually has priority, the one that was written first, that both the authors of Matthew and Luke have a copy of Mark, which they are continually correcting and expanding, but in order to explain additional sayings, especially of Matthew, of Luke, sayings of Jesus that are not found in Mark, the hypothesis holds that there must have been a saying source, something that looked a little like the Gospel of Thomas, that both Matthew and Luke had access to it, that is now lost. So if we are going to, again, say that Luke, instead of working from Mark and the Q saying source, is actually working from Marcion's gospel, this whole thing is upset, and we have to figure out how Mark and Matthew also relate to Marcion. And so the primary way that proponents of the priority of Marcion have done this is to posit that Marcion's gospel is actually the earliest. And then the other four gospel writers all had access to Marcion's gospel. So the author of Mark wrote his text with Marcion next to him, but by creating something that is not particularly like Marcion's gospel. That the author of Matthew had both Marcion's text and Mark, which is why Matthew absorbs almost all of Mark, but then corrects and changes things and adds things like what we would call the Q materials from Marcion into Matthew's gospel. That the author of the Gospel of John also, although while not having access to Mark, Matthew, or Luke, nevertheless had access to Marcion. And, by the time Luke gets written, Luke is not only just reworking Marcion's gospel, but also has access to John, Matthew, and Mark in order to create this. And so while this eliminates the need for Q, which is a really exciting prospect for so many people, because a lot of people don't like the idea that there is a lost text, even though almost all texts have been lost, and we can see source texts within all kinds of other texts that have been expanded. Marcion priority requires all of these Gospels to be redated to much later than they're normally understood. And it requires a remarkable editorial or redactional process on the part of each one of these authors, who has to, instead of being extremely parsimonious, like the author of Matthew, who preserves almost all of Mark, and if there was a Q source, also Q. Now the author of Matthew is not seen as parsimonious in that same way necessarily, because he's got, well, he has all of Mark and almost all of Luke from Marcion, but somehow the additions that he adds to Marcion's text, those are picked up by Luke, and that's why Luke is using those. And again, Luke's redactional priorities, having access to all of these texts, decides, not to include all kinds of things, including, stuff in John and so forth. So it requires a lot of explanation, new explanation, for why each of these gospel writers is including and excluding lots more material than they otherwise would have had access to in the traditional understanding of how these are put together. So one of the other problems that I find with this theory is that writers inevitably introduce anachronisms in their work. So already in the normal dating of the Gospels that we have at the end of the 2nd century, every one of these authors is trying to write about what is going on in the 30s. But they inevitably introduce anachronisms into their texts that relate to their own time. So for example, Mark, the author of Mark, is incredibly focused on the apocalyptic. Mark believes in a literal end of the world, and they believe that the calculations for that end of the world that were in the book of Daniel have now been realized, presumably because Jerusalem has just been destroyed by the Romans, and we're now in that period of a little season before the whole world is about to be destroyed. And that makes sense if Mark is writing sometime soon after the year 70. It doesn't make as much sense if Mark is writing in the year 150 or so. Similarly, the authors of John, even though they are pretending that they're writing about a story taking place in the 30s, they talk about how the Christians have been expelled from the synagogues. So something that has happened in recent memory in the Johannine community, so within the last 10, 20 years or so ago. And so they're introducing that anachronism. If everybody was actually writing in the mid-2nd century, there would be a lot more anachronisms from the 2nd century that they would be introducing, because no matter how much a proto-Orthodox Christian, like I say, might want to describe the churches that had existed in the 30s, so for example, because we know from texts at the earliest stratum like Paul, we are aware that the church in that era was led by apostles and prophets and so forth, and it was only at the very end of the first century and into the second century that that apostolic age was ending and the apostles were being displaced by bishops. If they were writing in the era after bishops had displaced apostles, I think that those gospel writers inevitably would talk about the church of their own experience, a church that includes bishops. The people who are writing the pseudo-Pauline letters, the letters of Timothy and Titus, just take bishops and bishops ruling churches as a background. They just assume that that's how it is, even though that shows that they are anachronistic to Paul. And not only would, I think, the gospel writers make this anachronism, accidental anachronism, the way the guys pretending to be Paul automatically do, they would have every incentive to say that Jesus appointed bishops. You know, they had to, instead, Clement of Rome has to make this convoluted argument that may not be historically accurate, that the apostles appointed bishops who then in turn appointed other bishops in apostolic succession. It would be a lot easier if you're just writing the Gospels themselves in the mid-second century to just simply say, Jesus appointed X number of bishops. This is how it's supposed to be. It also, the complicated text that we have of these weird 4 different witnesses of the Gospels is also more complicated, I think, to explain as a mid-second century phenomenon, wherein I think that the church was in a much stronger position. A community like Rome was in a much stronger position if they were able to start from scratch of writing a text that, just a single text that was very coherent and said all of the things that they would have wanted it to say to back up proto-Orthodox authority and so forth. So I think that that part of this comes from this thing that we've touched on a lot, why these kind of ideas have appeal. And I think it's one of the reasons why Marcion also has had a little bit of a revival of appeal. I went through at a lot of length tonight all of the ways that the God of the Old Testament, when read literally, you can't help but result in a very negative lens. And Christians reading gospel accounts frequently assume that they're effectively reading a biography of history of things that actually happened, that they're encountering the historical Jesus. So that's not true in either, certainly not in the Marcion priority, where the text will have been written down for the very first time in the middle of the 2nd century and have almost no coherence with the historical Jesus at all at that point. But even in their traditional dating, they're far enough away, written by people who aren't eyewitnesses, that these are not just a narrative, an eyewitness narrative of the historical Jesus. Instead, you're encountering the Jesus Christ of Scripture, the portraits, the individual and contradictory portraits that the evangelists are painting. The evangelists are painting that not from knowing the historical Jesus, but rather from being a position where they themselves are already Christians who believe in the risen Christ. And so they're at that much remove from the historical Jesus, and instead their writings are inspired by their interpretation of the risen Christ. But most critically, and I think also very much arguing against the idea that Marcion is at the base of all this, is where almost all of the non-historical Jesus source material comes from. And that is massively from reworking prophecies that are messianic predictions, or read as messianic predictions from the Hebrew Bible. So almost everywhere we've had whole lectures where We've talked about how much of the Passion, how much of the Easter story, all the details of it, have anything to do with the historical Jesus. And when we look through it, we found that almost every detail comes from the Psalms or from something that Isaiah says. You can tell almost the entire story by just stringing together quotations from the Old Testament. And you can understand why that would happen when Mark and Matthew, Luke, and also John, in other words, where these anonymous authors who are writing those 4 texts, who are very committed to the Septuagint Bible and like it, why they are mining it in order to create this narrative, taking the bare bones of what anybody knew and remembered about the historical Jesus and then adding to it everything that they believed about the Messiah based on the Septuagint. And it doesn't make any sense to me why Marcion would do any such thing, mining this book that he doesn't like, reading it in this kind of symbolic, typological way that the Proto-Orthodox do in order to craft those texts, when he is instead reading it literally as a history and being dissuaded by it. And so, an example of this is like, again, an only in Luke story, the widow of Nain, where Jesus goes and encounters this widow with her son and so forth. This is a story that doesn't have any other saying in any of the other Gospels or associated with any other Gospels, and instead is clearly like a reworking of a story told about Elijah in the Hebrew Bible. And so again, this is like one of these stories that it's hard to imagine why Marcion, in trying to craft a story of all the different things Jesus is doing, would draw so heavily upon this source and rework it and use it as a source for details in the gospel story. And so for all of these reasons, the complexity of the dating, the complexity of the redactional theory for all of the different gospels, I don't think, I'm very much not persuaded by the Marcion priority argument, and that's how I've kind of tried to portray that in this analysis. And so that's my take on Marcion, who nevertheless is an incredibly important and influential early Christian, even if he may not have been the originator of the earliest gospel. He nevertheless is the originator of the earliest canon and is a major impetus for the organization of what becomes the church when it does organize. So I'm going to get some water, and Mike is going to collect your comments and questions, and we can have it out here. So I want to thank people who've been giving donations. So thanks very much to the American Legacy Construction, to Neil Diatley, to Eric Nordquist, to Fred Patton, to Ron Wagner, to Deborah Wells, to Deborah Day Lynn, to Nancy Barnett, to Frederick Church, to Ronald Ginta, Clifton Stuckey, to Ryan Swindle. Thanks also to Galen DaCosta, to Douglas LaForme, and Diana Patterson. We really appreciate all of your contributions. So thanks also for the donation today to Anders Andalister, who asks, what did Marcion think about hell, the devil, and or punishment, and also what do Gnostics think about the same? So, so I'm trying to think of now how, it was a good question, and I did not actually go through and look at how the devil figures into the statements. So we saw that in the reconstruction of the beginning of Marcion's gospel, that Jesus goes straight from appearing in the reign of Tiberius to then descending to Capernaum, and so that skipped the Satan tempting Jesus in the wilderness. So maybe there is no need for a cosmic devil in Marcionism, since the evil principle is actually the material God, and so that would be my presumption. In terms of Gnostics, they also don't need a devil to be part of their principles, because they the emanations, include actually the negative material principle is the Yaldabaoth, and so I'm presuming that's also what's true for Marcion, and so the hell is essentially, I think, being in the material world, and for the Gnostics, that's if you aren't one of the elect, if you don't have a divine spark, this flawed material life is all you're going to ever have, and then you'll have oblivion. And heaven is having your spirit return to, for the Gnostics, return to the realm of the spirit realm, the realm of the eternal, everything that is good, and that is also how Marcion sees essentially going to the realm that Jesus bridges for us, as the Son of the true God. So that would be where the heaven is anyway. Ron Wagner says, are there any writings by Apollos? No. So Apollos, as we said, was understood to be a leader, he's an historical figure because Paul talks about him as someone who ends up in Corinth after Paul left. So Paul plants the Corinthian church, and then he says, I planted, Apollos came and watered. So in other words, he ends up being a leader of the congregation who comes afterwards. And some of the Corinthians are breaking into factions and saying the actual authority here is Paul, the actual authority here is Apollos, the actual authority is Peter, and so they're asserting that different apostles are authoritative. And Paul tries to get them to say, let's not have factions, we're all on the same team, but we don't have any. So Apollos is a historical figure, we don't have any writings from him. He is a figure that also exists in the book of Acts, so the author of the book of Acts has traditions that they know about Apollos. I think they suggest that he comes from Alexandria, but we don't know anything more than that, and we don't have any writings, no. So Demiglot, thank you so much for your support, appreciate it. Demiglot asks, it seems there was a complex variety of early Christian groups. Do we think there was something special about Christianity in this era, or is this likely typical of all ancient religious traditions? So it's just normal, I think, when we don't have where there's no central authority, there's no communication. Paul, we don't have, you can write letters to each other and send messengers and so forth. Paul himself explains in his letters that when he had a experience with the risen Christ, when he converted, from being a persecutor of the church to being an apostle, as far as he understood it, of the church, that he made a very big point of not going to Jerusalem or talking to any of the other existing apostles, but instead setting out freelance and starting to preach the gospel and convert and plant churches in what he calls Arabia, but probably what we now think of as Jordan. So he, and Syria maybe. And so he starts doing that all on his own. And so you can imagine that the congregations that he planted are not going to be in particularly strong alignment with ones that other apostles who are in contact with James and Peter and John in Jerusalem, the way they might be planting them. And so I think it's just natural that different groups are going to, they're starting with very different founders who have different ideas and attitudes, and then the church themselves maintains their own independent traditions. And so I think that's very normal. So I don't think that that's unique to Christianity. Certainly the religion that almost all of the people across Syria and Anatolia, Greece and Rome are converting from, the religion of the old gods of Greece and Rome, is so impossibly diverse. Every practice of it is intensely localized. People, kind of have a syncretic view where they sort of see, okay, well, our god Baal is the same as your god Zeus, who's the same as the Roman god Jupiter is the same as the Egyptian god Amun or whatever. And sometimes there is a kind of a national syncretist, Hellenized version of a cult like Serapis or something like that. But almost everybody in their local practices, you're going to have your god of your own, your town, the gods, frankly, that are and spirits and penates, your household gods, things that are ruling over your life, your neighborhood, the crossroads that you go by. Everything is going to have very unique, localized traditions, just incredible diversity. We call it all paganism now, using the much later anachronistic term, but it's incredibly diverse. And so I don't think Christianity is, should be singled out in that sense. Ron Wagner says, are there any modern Christian churches that follow Mosaic law? So there is, so whereas the ancient Jewish Christian sects died out or were forced out, suppressed by the Roman Empire, there have been revivals of that. So there's a whole modern movements of like Jews for Jesus and things like that. And so where there are people who, on the one hand, have modern Jewish background, who nevertheless look at what Christ is teaching, identify that as being actually really in keeping with like Christ as a rabbi. What Christ is teaching is actually very kind of typical. The arguments that he has with the Pharisees are the kind of arguments that rabbis have with each other, and so on. And so they who already are maintaining keeping kosher as Jewish, as they now adopt Jesus and Christianity on top of that, they continue to follow Mosaic law. The other side of that is then there are lots of Christians who don't have Jewish background, but who start to really like the Old Testament, who then start adopting different parts of that. And so, for example, there will be different Christian groups that decide, well, we really should be practicing some of the Jewish festivals, the Festival of the Booths or other kinds of festivals like that, instead of traditional Christian holidays, some of which they think are maybe pagan, that have made their way into Christian practice, some of which they may be correct about that, but in every event they start practicing different components of Jewish law. Within the Latter-day Saint movement, there started to be the idea that, especially let's say there's the group called the Strangites, James Strang, who is an alternative Mormon prophet of a different component of the religion. One of the texts that he sought to restore was what he called the Book of the Law, which is essentially a restored version of Mosaic law. And so at the base of that are the 10 Commandments, but with one commandment, he says that what was restored, that is, should have been in the original, but the Bible has been corrupted, and that was love your neighbor as yourself. And so he creates then a whole kind of new Mosaic law that has a lot of roots in the Old Testament that become important for Strangite Mormons anyway to obey, and that includes some of the festivals and things like that. So yeah, there's a bunch of modern Christian churches that pick and choose and use parts of it, and some who try to obey it, like Rabbinic Judaism, some who are descendants of Rabbinic Judaism who have now also adopted Christianity. So yes. I Was Never Here has 2 questions for me. One, why did Marcion reject the pastoral epistles for his canon? So there's a couple options. So we don't know exactly, like when the pastoral letters are written. He might have thought that they were late, and if they're too late, then he's making his canon before them. He may not have had access to them. They might not have been circulating with the other letters. So it's one of the arguments that the scholars have even made that show that early Christians didn't necessarily either have them or think that they were authentic. And so that's besides the more important answer for me, which is that they contain a bunch of anachronisms and different themes than the authentic Pauline letters. And so for that reason, we can only speculate, why he didn't include them. And then the second question was, why did the Christian canon eventually include the Catholic epistles? So that's the Catholic epistles are the ones that are like the epistle of 1st and 2nd Peter, James, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Jude. So in other words, these other general, it's called Catholic, but that means general epistles written by authors essentially with the idea that they're written to the general church. So the Proto-Orthodox created a canon, and it took a long time to sort out what was going to be included in it. So as of Marcion's time, our understanding is that different Christian communities may have had their one major gospel that they were focusing on, whether it was Luke or Matthew or John, probably not Mark, which was already becoming rarer. And then they would have had different texts that they had access to and others that they didn't. And these included some that are being read as scripture that don't make it into the canon, like the Didache or 1st Clement or the Shepherd of Hermas and other texts like that. And so why they ultimately started developing these canon lists after Marcion made his canon list falls down on a couple ideas. So one, do the texts have, do they have antiquity? So are we seeing them as being a text that was known early on? So Eusebius and other writers, Jerome, when they're talking about it, Origen, they're saying earlier writers aren't mentioning this text much, and so I'm putting it onto the disputed list. And then also, does it have apostolic authority, or in really pretended apostolic authority? So the anonymous Gospels get assigned names. The anonymous Epistle to the Hebrews gets assigned the name of Paul, even though it wasn't written by him. And the pastoral epistles, even though they likely were not written by the Apostle John or the actual brother of Jesus, James and Jude, or certainly not by the Apostle Peter, those two letters, they nevertheless, over time, the leaders started to think, well, maybe they all were written by them, and so that's why they made it in. And so really important early texts like Clement's letter, Clement clearly wasn't an apostle. He's writing in the post-apostolic age. And so even though it's a very early and important text, it doesn't get included. Likewise, the Shepherd of Hermas and the Didache, even though it's kind of has the idea of the teachings of the 12 apostles, it was not believed to be by enough authorities to include it, so it got excluded. And the very last text to squeak in is the book of Revelation, which is written by a guy named John, who is not the Apostle John, but enough people at the end thought, well, maybe it was the Apostle John, that they ended up including it. So that's why they made it in. Saint Brush, thank you for your support. Edward Contreras, thank you for your support. Ricky Palacios says, where did Marcion get the idea that the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament were two different gods? So I think Ricky, what he did was he read all of those texts, those Old Testament texts that I kind of went through, where God in the Old Testament is portrayed as being able to walk around, make noise, have a very material form, and also does things that are very vengeful and petty. He just thinks that's totally incompatible with how Jesus talked about God. When Jesus is talking about God having such great love for us, Paul is talking about how God's love for us has allowed us to be in harmony with Him, and that's how we're going to now be very pleased at the good news is that we're going to be able to achieve salvation. So in other words, God has all this mercy, even though we're all flawed beings, as we know, that we're getting this gift of infinite grace from God. And so they don't see. So if you're really focused and you read them literally in that way, you can say, well, these aren't compatible, and that's what his argument is. And so he wrote a book where he took all the things that the Old Testament God does and all the things that within his canon of the New Testament, his gospel and the Pauline letters, how that God is described, and says these don't line up, and that's his conclusion. Yeah. So Kafkaeus says, in light of Mark 9:40 and Luke 9:50, the teaching which Jesus has, whoever is not against us is for us, is the concept of heresy even biblical? Yeah, exactly. So in that sense, no, right? So yeah, Jesus is saying let's not. We should actually err on the other side. So if you have a person who is a direct antagonist, okay, they're against us, but everybody else who's not against us, we might as well just say, okay, if they're not directly an antagonist, an enemy, they're actually for us, and let's ignore them. But yeah, that's one bit of advice. But the way that people have the idea that heresy is biblical is there's a lot of let's say teachings in especially like Matthew's gospel where there's always like there's all kinds of parables that involve dividing. So you have wheat growing up with tares, and so you have to collect them up, and all of the wheat is going to be saved, and all of the tares are going to be burned. And judgment, there's the sheep and the goats, and so there's the wicked and so forth. So some people are representing goats, and they're the heretics. There's the net and the great catch, and so all the good fish are intermixed with all of the worthless junk that rolls up in your net. And so we'll preserve all the good fish, and we're going to burn all of those things. So all of those are interpreted as saying, we got to separate the good fish here from the heretics, and so I think that they also have precedents where they can at least biblical precedents where later proto-Orthodox folks can say we need to separate people who are teaching things that are contrary to our understanding from the flock. I was never here said, should we abandon the dichotomy of Old Testament God versus New Testament God, since the Bible's evolution gives us many divine profiles of God? Both Old Testament and New Testament have violent and benevolent. Absolutely, I agree with you entirely. So part of the problem here is this idea that all the texts in the Old Testament are somehow, like one book, and all the texts of the New Testament are somehow one book. They are all diverse texts that each one of them has their own perspective, and they're each doing things. So the God as portrayed in the book of Job is written by actually multiple authors, and it's actually a composite view where people are suggesting all kinds of different things about divinity, working that out in within the wisdom tradition. Well, that tradition is very different from the tradition that involves both the Torah, the 5 books attributed to Moses, and the Deuteronomic histories. It has a very particular perspective on God and the meaning of life that's different from the wisdom perspective. And likewise, the prophetic perspective in books like Isaiah have a very different sense indeed as well. And like you say, all of the New Testament writers also have their own perspective. And so for all of these, I think the problem is when we fixate on an image of God portrayed in one of these texts, we then view that with excessive literalism, which then takes an idea that we understand as, by definition, infinite, unknowable, beyond human comprehension or explanation with finite words, and limit that universal God to this perspective of this particular ancient and limited person who is is trying to give their conception of their experience and knowledge of the divine within their own framework. So yes, I think we should abandon that. And not just think that we can contrast the Old Testament God and the New Testament God. We could also assemble quotes of, the New Testament God doing all kinds of things, or allowing, for example, in the book of Revelation, if you were to read that literally, allowing all kinds of horrors to occur in the world as well, or predicting. Michael Liu says, is there some heritage of Marcion that goes down to the Cathars and the Bogomils before? So that is an open question. But the problem that we lack here is we lack the actual sources that can connect the dots. So what we can say is that that there are Bogomils. So in other words, there's dualist Christians that are existing in the East, and that especially get established in the Balkans, that perhaps have a bunch of inspiration to dualist Christians that are operating in North Italy and southern France. And so there could be some kind of connection between a surviving dualism from either Anatolia or Syria and Persia, coming from Marcionism as some kind of inheritance that potentially makes it all the way to influence Catharism. But it's also possible that that these ideas can be independently rethought up. So one of the solutions to the problem of evil is the idea, well, there's a good God that that is our true parent, who wants the best for us, but we still have all this suffering because there's also another force that is preventing the good God from doing all the things that we want. But eventually the good God's going to win out, and everything will be great. And so that's a solution that people can come up with, whether independently, without having a transmission of some of these ideas. But it's also possible that there is transmission points, we just don't have the evidence for it. One of the things that happens is that because the people who write about the Bogomils and the Cathars, which are the highly literate Eastern and then Western medieval churchmen, who are busily learning all of their scholarship from reading ancient and medieval texts, they listen to all the things that they're hearing people say they believe, let's say under torture, during an interrogation, and then they're saying, okay, well, that two principles thing, that's Catharism, that's Manichaeism, or something like that. So in other words, they're aware of a name for the thing that they've plucked out of ancient history, and so then they apply it in the present day. And so it's also possible that that's how the connection is being made, not through a historical transmission, but because the observer is actually aware of antiquity and is applying that to their contemporary ideas. Mary Magnuson says, when did one of the early church fathers first reference either birth narrative? I don't think Marcion eliminated it. I don't think it was there originally and added later. So it's not in Mark, for sure. And so part of the normal the two-source hypothesis is that there is no tradition as of when the first gospel writer, as it's traditionally understood, is writing. So the author of Mark is not aware of any such tradition. And the idea of it is that both the authors of Luke and Matthew each have Mark, and they each have a bunch of sayings of Jesus, and they have whatever traditions their own church has preserved, but I argue actually that they each independently create birth narratives for Jesus to make a more full gospel in each case, and they draw upon the Septuagint in order to find sources. And so messianic prophecies say that the Messiah is going to be born in Bethlehem, and so they both figure out a way to make that happen, although those ways are contradictory, and they each work in other Septuagint source things like reinterpreting, like Matthew reinterpreting a passage from the Old Testament, "Out of Egypt I have called my son." It really refers to my son being Israel as a nation, but Matthew works it into the narrative of having a flight to Egypt and the family of Jesus, Mary, Joseph, and Jesus come out of Egypt and so forth. So in other words, drawing upon all the Old Testament texts to construct their narrative. In terms of it being a coherent part of the Gospel of Luke, part of the problem, I think, of Marcion priority is that Luke and Acts together are a very coherent seemingly a work of a very coherent author. So as opposed to like an author who is busily expanding a smaller Marcionite gospel to make it be the whole larger book of Luke, Acts, including the nativity story, it's such a coherent whole that it's complicated, I think, to make that argument. And so in terms of not having the birth narrative as part of the original part of Luke, is that I feel like that section is a lot like how Luke writes everything. Even when Luke does have a source, the author is able to rework it a lot, as Mark gets reworked. But the problem with it for Marcion's gospel is it's like almost all of it is being reworked in that sense. So I don't know. I don't know what the answer, though, in terms of what's the earliest church father that references the birth narrative. I would have to look that up. So I don't know. We'd have to look that up. K. Tempest Bradford. It makes me wonder what Marcion was reading or hearing to get him to this point, other than the Hebrew Bible. So yeah. So it's possible. It's not entirely clear, right? So we don't have his own writings, and so it's possible that he's in Anatolia, he's from churches that are descended from Paul's creation, or people from churches that are from Paul's plantations anyway. If Paul didn't make it actually to Sinope, but it's not clear what, and there presumably, again, since he has a collection of Paul's letters, that's got to be the kind of the focus of how he's understanding Christianity, as opposed to any of the other letters or things that make it into the New Testament. And so presumably it's a focus on that, while simultaneously having within that tradition the Hebrew Bible, but rejecting it. And one of the problems ultimately for Marcion, I think, in putting such an emphasis on Paul is extremely committed to the Hebrew Bible. So Paul is constantly quoting and using the Old Testament examples in order to make his points and prove his points. And so it's another, I think, reason why, even though there's a lot of impetus, there's a lot of things we don't like about the Hebrew Bible, almost all the material, though, is really based on it, and that includes Paul, and it includes, the Gospel of Luke, and so it is a really hard sell to just jettison it all. Dartharama, Deborah asks, did Marcion believe Jews committed deicide, or was he just rejecting a cruel Old Testament God? So since Jesus is, in fact, doesn't actually have a material physical body, he only seems human. He doesn't really die on the cross. He's a divine being, spiritual being who only seemed to. And so Jews didn't actually commit deicide. They rejected the message of the Son of the true God, but as they remain committed to Yahweh, the Old Testament God, in Marcion conception. Yardo of Galvestonia, thank you so much for your support. Quanump says, do I have any thoughts on Simon Magus being a straw man for Marcion, who's then gets shoved back into the first century. So yeah, it's so Simon Magus is a story for is a story that appears in the Gospel of Luke. Essentially, the first he represents a couple things, and so because he's an actual magician, and he encounters Peter and the other apostles who are able to perform great wonders in Jesus' name, and he then wants to buy the formula for that from Peter, and so Peter kind of explains that this is not how it works. That on the one hand, what we're doing is not magic. These are things that are divine miracles that God is performing, and we're not actually causing them to perform. So the difference between magic and miracles in the Book of Acts formulation. And then Simon also becomes the guy named for the sin simony, which is to say the idea of being able to buy your office. And so in the Middle Ages, if a bishop, a prospective bishop, goes to the king, if the king has it in his authority to appoint whoever is going to be the Bishop of Colchester, and somebody says, hey, if you make my son the Bishop of Colchester, I'll give you all this money, that's simony. So Simon Magus has a whole long holdover. I'm not sure that, so if the priority of Marcion were correct, in other words, if Marcion was the first gospel and then Luke, Acts especially, is then written after, then yeah, I would think that would make a lot of sense, that the proto-Orthodox who are rejecting Marcion would have created this character in order to, as maybe a mask to say, hey, this is what Marcion is doing. But if it's dated according to the normal understanding, the general scholarly consensus, then that Simon Magus story is from the 80s or 90s as it's written. And so Marcion, who later gives this big donation, could have been accused of simony, although Marcion isn't understood to have been trying to buy the office of being Bishop of Rome. His contemporary Valentinus was apparently, or was claimed to anyway, been campaigning to be made bishop, not Marcion. So in that sense, Marcion is not, he's giving a big donation, which isn't necessarily, my church is not opposed to that. If you want to give us a big donation, but what we would be opposed to is giving a big donation to then be given, to be then made the pastor, or be made, in charge, be the bishop or something. So it doesn't quite line up. Jamriki says, Luke 4:23 says, do here also in your hometown the things we've heard you do at Capernaum, except Jesus only goes to Capernaum later in 4:31. But in Marcion's gospel, Jesus is already at Capernaum. So do you think that this could be a Marcionite attempt to affix the order of things, an argument for Marcionite priority? So that would be, yeah, that does sound like an argument for Marcionite priority, although the problem with it is that we again don't have the full text of the Gospel of Marcion, and so the reconstruction, I think, fixes it so that it makes that issue, as opposed to what we have in the Gospel of Luke, where we have the full text. So it's harder for us to make sure that know exactly what the order and everything else and the complete text of Marcion, since we only have quotations. But certainly, I think that probably has been one of the arguments that proponents of Marcionite priority could maybe look to. Beep Boop says, what about the view that Marcion did not write his gospel, but that a shorter version of Luke already existed and he published it alongside the letters he collected? So that would be a possibility. So that does not affect that doesn't affect the other problem. That doesn't affect the rest of the whole synoptic problem, right? So we don't know in a lot of cases that the versions of the Gospels as we have them were exactly the way that they were circulating early on. So there's, for example, an argument that one of the some of the minor agreement between Luke and Matthew is that the Gospel of Mark that they each had access to was a slightly different version of it than the Gospel of Mark that we now have. So in other words, that Mark was circulating at different redactional periods or something like that. And so, and we also, in our looking at the Gospel of John as we have it right now, we've looked how there are very obvious seams in it where at the very minimum, there was an earlier version of the gospel that has been now added to, where the last chapter has been added onto it, and like the free-floating pericope of the woman taken in adultery has been added into it, and so on. That there would have been an earlier version. So in those cases, we have some idea that there are circulating other versions or earlier versions or smaller versions. So it could be possible as well that there was an earlier or different version, shorter version of Luke, and Marcion had it. And if that were the case, then maybe that also informed his ideas. So unlike, if it was more aligned with his ideas, then it informed his ideas. So unlike Tertullian's argument that Marcion had edited it to conform with his ideas, if there was one that already existed that was circulating that we don't have, that more conformed with his ideas, then that might actually have informed those ideas. So that would be another possibility. David Latorra says, Marcion's greatest legacy was to initiate an official collection of the New Testament at a time when Christians were no longer motivated by Armageddon. So that's an interest. That's more or less a statement than a question. But so yeah, exactly. So we're now like we say, when we're looking at some of these texts, the earliest texts are at the strata that exist before bishops and apostles have taken, before bishops and deacons have taken in charge, when Paul and others are arguing over whether Gentile Christians need to adhere to the law of Moses. The next strata up, it's especially even more frenzied apocalyptic as people are really believing that a literal end is about to hit us, like the Gospel of Mark. The next strata is people who have now been reinterpreting this because the end of the world didn't come in the lifetime of the first generation. And so books like the Gospel of John, which have one of the most anti-literal apocalyptic books that makes it into the Bible. And so now we're into this strata where we're now arguing about other things, as in terms of should bishops be in charge? What should we even be doing with the entire Jewish inheritance and so forth? And so in this mid-2nd century stratum, people start getting serious about collecting all of these writings, like you say, and deciding, well, Marcion listed which text should be authoritative. We don't agree with him as proto-Orthodox leaders, but we want to create our own list. Fire Ever Living says, what was Marcion's eschatology? So I'm not sure that I didn't read that part of it. So I'm not sure if he is seeing anything like an imminent end of the world. It probably maybe not, because of the God that is interacting with the world is really alien to it, and the world is going on, but maybe we ourselves are trying to bring about an end to it by ceasing propagation and ceasing to continue with the terrible creation, so that we can all eventually abandon materialism and go back to the true God. Otherwise, the only way it would happen is, in other words, the God of Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, that is the operating material God, may well destroy the world again, I guess, in fire, as is predicted, but it wouldn't be the good God that's doing it, I presume. Heretic Annihilator 9000 says, there is no way for Luke to be 2nd century. Not only did Marcion say Luke wrote it, Luke Acts knows place names in Judean geography. 2nd century forged Gospels don't. Yeah, so again, there's all kinds of, yeah, if you compare Luke and the other canonical Gospels side by side with like later Gospels, they quickly have very different they have very different priorities, and the anachronisms start to get really out of control. So we've done a bunch of lectures on the infancy Gospels and things like that. So I agree with you. They kind of betray the time frame, and so redating everything is a very big ask. Yurt Enthusiast says, what does John think about how many lost Marcions there might have been throughout history, suppressed by Orthodox figures, folks like the Cathars and so on? Yeah, so obviously there have been a whole bunch of them, but this is not, again, unique to Christianity. So Christianity, you know, when you get to a society that has kind of a, you know, a majoritarian, you know, ethnic religious structure to it, there are times when those societies, whether it's, you know, medieval China, the medieval Muslim world, you know, medieval Christianity, and so forth, where places are more or less tolerant depending on priorities. And so at different times, you know, the issue with Marcion as opposed to the Cathars later is that Christianity is incredibly unimportant and is a tiny minority in the 2nd century. And so it's as much a movement of trying to, for the Orthodox to try to define who we are and who we are going to be, as opposed to you know, which always inevitably involves defining who we're not, and leaving the Marcionites off. It's when it's later after Marcion. It's when the church becomes patronized by the imperial government, and then especially centuries later under Theodosius, when the church becomes persecuting and intolerant, both of pagans and especially of heretics at that point, that the church starts to oppress or suppress and eliminate both the Jewish Christians, the Gnostics, and Marcionites, along with religions like Manichaeism and so forth. That's when it really gets like that. And that kind of religion, or that kind of state/religion combo that exists in the imperial church, late imperial church, is more akin to the West in France and northern Italy, when the church again really gets going and is working hand in hand with secular rulers. So, you know, the Cathars are destroyed in part because they are representing, in, you know, a heterodox view, but they also get wiped out because the King of France and northern French nobles get a lot of advantage about going south, taking control of the south of France, disposing all of the landowners there and taking all of that land for themselves. So that's I guess a little bit different of a reason for why that happens at that point too. But there's lots of them, yeah, of course. That's happening throughout all of history, and that's one of the things that's so interesting about history is the paths that are not taken, and some that linger on, and some that continue to this day, some that go extinct, and in some cases are revived. Deborah Dartharama says, also thank you for your support. Deborah says, Centerplace not wanting to keep you up forever, but if time, are there differences in Luke, in Acts, about the ideas of salvation? Deborah, you're going to have to, I don't know, give me some examples on either one of those, and we'll maybe do that, save that one for next time. So I'm not thinking offhand about of how salvation is being portrayed in Acts in a way that's different from in Luke. There's different episodes in each one, of course, different maybe some different sayings, but since they're from together, I think everyone recognizes the same author. They can't be too very different, but they probably may be different focuses, and so you'll have to maybe talk to me about what you're thinking of. So thanks so much. Thanks, everybody. So we've got some different lecture topics that you guys have been proposing. So Andrew Jime says, let's do Catherine of Alexandria. Jeremy Brown says, let's do Spinoza. Dartharama Deborah says, how about a lecture on the Odyssey? Nolan's incredible movie has brought the conversation back. Yeah, we've been talking about seeing it. We haven't actually, I haven't actually gone to a movie theater in like 3 or 4 years, maybe once since the pandemic. But anyway, so I should go see that, and then that would allow us to do that. Kafka House says, I would like to see a lecture on the historicity of Muhammad and an academic critique of the Quran. That would be wonderful. I would like to see that too. So Kafka House also says, what about Secret Mark? I love Secret Mark. I believe it's authentic, but go ahead, do a lecture and show it's not authentic if it's not authentic. Appreciate your openness to that. Secret Mark is a very interesting text. I think Secret Mark is very interesting. I think I'm not persuaded that it's authentic, but I still think it's a cool idea. So anyway, we'll see. Maybe so. I was thinking of doing one on fragment Gospels and lost Gospels, and because I think the Secret Mark might be too short to have for its own lecture, but we could do that with things like the Edgerton Gospel and some of the other papyrus fragment Gospels. This is another thing that is complex about trying to redate all the Gospels so late, is that there's so many randomly circulating Gospel fragments that I think that need to be coming from the earlier chaotic period or thereafter. So, Patty O'Reilly, when can we get a watch along and lecture on the Exodus Decoded? The Exodus Decoded is only an hour and 33 minutes long. I would like to hear John's review of it and find it very enlightening. So yeah, Patty, we've heard that talked about, and so maybe we can, we definitely put that. We definitely had that on the list when we were talking about the next movie watch and review, and so we'll put that one on the list. Paula Strange, my suggestion for a movie is What Dreams May Come with Robin Williams. Amazing film. All right, well, Paula, thank you. Let's put that also on our list as we're picking future movies to review. And meanwhile, thank you all so very much. We appreciate all of your support. And we remind you, hey, if you haven't, like, share, and subscribe, and all those good things. And we will see you next week. In the meantime, we'll post what the lecture will be.